It's week 11 of the fantasy football season. We're without two stud quarterbacks this week due to bye weeks. We have no Baker Mayfield. We have no Kyler Murray. What do we have? We're diving into the top 20 quarterbacks for week 11. That's right, we're going to dive into my top 20 quarterback rankings here for week 11 fantasy football. However, before that, let's take a look at some of my bigger hits and misses from the week prior. Now, when it comes to the quarterback position, a few of my bigger hits: Joe Burrow, Brock Purdy, Patrick Mahomes. For Joe Burrow, had him up inside tier 1. Joe Burr produced. How about Brock Purdy? I had him ranked up inside the top 7 last week, finished as the quarterback 5. Patrick Mahomes kind of made him a Verge quarterback 1, ranking him at quarterback 12. He finished as the QB 11, but I had some big time misses as well, like Sam Darnold, Derek Carr, and Matthew Stafford. For Sam Darnold, 3 interceptions. Are you absolutely kidding me? This is old school Sam Darnold that we saw in week 10. Derek Carr, I guess all he needed was MVS, and then Matthew Stafford had 46 pass attempts, which is great. Had you told me that leading up to week 10, I would have been pumped. But 0 touchdowns, WTF Matthew Stafford. But let's move past week 10, let's move into week 11 and bring up tier 1 for the quarterback position. And when we look at tier 1, we got the likes of Jalen Hurts, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, Brock Purdy, and Jaden Daniels. But at the top of the rankings, you see Jalen Hurts. He's got a matchup going up against Washington. And the return of rushing touchdowns have made Jalen Hurts one of the hottest fantasy quarterbacks here in the last month of the season. Over the last 4 weeks, he is the quarterback 1 overall, has had 8 rushing touchdowns over his last 4 games alone. He only had 2 in the first 5 games of the season. Now he gets a matchup going up against Washington that could turn into a potential shootout, and the Commanders allow over 17 fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, so Jalen Hurts is at number 1. Number 2 is Josh Allen going up against Kansas City, and the 20-point streak continues. He's now had 5 straight games over 20 fantasy points. He's one of only 5 quarterbacks on the year to average over 20 fantasy points per game. He's had multiple touchdowns in every game he's played in his career against the Kansas City Chiefs, who allow over 17 fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, and we already know it's easier to throw on Kansas City than it is to run on them. Then we got Lamar Jackson going up against Pittsburgh, the current QB1 overall in fantasy football, averaging 26 fantasy points per game, has 14 passing touchdowns over the last 4 weeks alone. But this one is a pretty tough matchup. But how about a little fun fact first? Lamar Jackson has never had a rushing touchdown against the Pittsburgh Steelers, and neither team has scored over 20 points since November of 2020. Pittsburgh allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, but Lamar is on that MVP level, so he's still at number 3. Number 4 is Joe Burrow going up against the Chargers, and Burrow and Chase are just out there teabagging opponents at this point. Joe Burrow has 9 touchdowns over his last 2 games alone. The current quarterback 3 overall on the season, and has had 3 30-point games over his last 6 games played. Plus, we could be nearing the return of T. Higgins, and it's easier to throw on the Chargers than it is to run on them. How about Brock Purdy next going up against Seattle? And Purdy remains one of the safer weekly quarterbacks. Now, despite all the injuries in San Francisco, he's scored at least 20 fantasy points in 4 straight games. We know he has Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, Jawan Jennings, Ricky Pearsall, and he's thrown multiple touchdowns in 4 of the 5 career games he's played against Seattle, who currently allows the 12th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. And then lastly, to round out tier 1, it's Jaden Daniels going up against Philadelphia. Is he cooling off, or was week 10 just a tough matchup? Let's give the Steelers just a little bit of credit. That was a very tough matchup last week for Jaden Daniels. Pittsburgh allowed the 3rd fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. But what about Philadelphia? They allow the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. However, this is why you need to dive a little bit deeper. 4 of their last 5 games were against the likes of Cleveland, the New York Giants, Jacksonville, and Dallas, all of which haven't really been killing it at the quarterback position this season. Really hoping this game can turn into a shootout and Jaden Daniels and Jalen Hurts can go back and forth. All right, let's bring up Tier 2, this is where I got Russell Wilson, Patrick Mahomes, CJ Stroud, Bo Nix, Justin Herbert, Matthew Stafford, and Geno Smith. For Russell Wilson, he's going up against Baltimore, and the Russ revival continues in Pittsburgh. He's averaging over 19 fantasy points per game in his 3 starts, has 7 total touchdowns over those 3 games, and now this offense is starting to acclimate to Mike Williams being a part of it. We already basically know that George Pickens is unguardable out there, and Russ is going to look for him down the field. Plus, this running game in Pittsburgh, not 100% healthy. Najee Harris currently questionable to play, and in a matchup going up against Baltimore, who allows the 2nd most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, Russell Wilson all the way up at the top of Tier 2. How about Patrick Mahomes going against Buffalo? At least the last few weeks have been a little bit better for Mahomes. He's still throwing weekly interceptions, but he does have 5 passing touchdowns over his last 3 games. Now, last week, it was a tough matchup for DeAndre Hopkins. Couldn't really see more of a ceiling game for Mahomes last week because of that. But Mahomes has had multiple touchdowns in all but 1 game against Buffalo in his career, and it sounds like he could be getting back Juju Smith-Schuster this week. That's why he's up a couple spots to number 8. Number 9 is CJ Stroud going up against Dallas, and this dude desperately needs Nico Collins. But at least it sounds like he's going to come back here in week 11. All signs are pointing that direction anyway. But CJ Stroud only has 2 passing touchdowns over the last month of the season. Over the last 6 weeks, he's actually had 5 fumbles and 4 interceptions. We know Tank Dell isn't 100% healthy, but this matchup is a get-right matchup going up against Dallas, who allows the 4th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. Now, if Nico Collins is ruled out for whatever reason this week, CJ Stroud probably going to fall outside the top 12. How about Bo Nix up next going up against Atlanta? And he was so close to pulling off the win against Kansas City last week. He's the current quarterback 9 overall in the season. He's completed over 70% of his passes in 2 of the last 3 games he's played. Now the rushing, it's kind of slowed here as of late, which is really limiting his upside, but he's still playing great football. And then you take into account this is a good matchup as well going up against Atlanta, who allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Bo Nix at number 10. 11 is Justin Herbert, probably the highest he's been ranked this entire season going up against Cincinnati. And he's really been more fantasy relevant here as of late. 3 straight games over 19 fantasy points, has had multiple touchdowns now in 3 straight ball games, and he's actually using his legs a little bit more here as of late. He's had at least 30 yards rushing in 2 of his last 3 games played. Now he's a little bit more matchup dependent. A matchup like this one, because Cincinnati, they allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, so Justin Herbert is up inside the top 12. Now, if we go down to number 12, this is where we have Matthew Stafford going up against New England. The numbers have been so much better the last 3 weeks, but 0 touchdowns last week absolutely sucked huevos. He's averaging over 40 pass attempts a game, which is great. He's had 3 straight games with at least 275 yards passing, which is great. He just needs to find the end zone more consistently, and this is another one of those tough matchups. New England, they actually allow the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but with a healthy Puka and a healthy Kupp, Matthew Stafford's still going to be inside the top 12. Then we got Geno Smith here going up against San Francisco. He's coming off the bye week. Sounds like DK Metcalf could make his way back this week as well. And we already know that Seattle is more of a pass-heavy team in 2024. The last time these 2 teams faced off, Geno Smith threw the ball 52 times in that matchup. He's going to have to do the same thing again this week if they want to have a chance on beating San Francisco. All right, now we're through 2 tiers. Let's move down to tier 3. And in this tier, we got Jared Goff, Sam Darnold, Tua Tagovailoa, Jordan Love, Jameis Winston, Kirk Cousins, and Aaron Rodgers. Now for Jared Goff, he's going up against Jacksonville. And he's kind of been one of those guys that's more safe than ceiling here as of late. He hasn't thrown for over 250 yards now in a game in the last 3 weeks. The running game is just so dominant and heavily used, he doesn't have to go out there and throw the ball all 4 quarters. And now he has a matchup going up against Jacksonville. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. Now Jacksonville last week played pretty well against Sam Darnold and the Minnesota Vikings. However, they still allowed over 400 yards of total offense, so Jared Goff right here at the top of tier 3. Then we got Sam Darnold going up against Tennessee. And we just saw 2018 Sam Darnold back in 2024. Dude is a time traveler. He had no touchdowns and 3 interceptions against Jacksonville in week 10, and that caught everyone off guard. They still got the win, but it wasn't pretty. Now he gets a matchup going up against Tennessee, whose defense is pretty banged up, so he's going to have a chance to bounce back. How about Tua Tagovailoa going up against the Las Vegas Raiders? And Tua, another one of those quarterbacks who as of late has been more safe than ceiling since returning from the concussion issues earlier in the season. He's averaging only 13.8 fantasy points per game since returning. We know Tyreek Hill isn't 100% healthy, and Jalen Waddle hasn't gone over 60 yards receiving in a game since week 1. But Las Vegas allows the 8th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position. There's a lot of lack of consistency right now in Tua Tagovailoa, and that's why he's fallen down the rankings, but the Dolphins need to start winning or their season is going to be over. Now, after Tua, we got Jordan Love going up against Chicago. He's coming off the bye week. Hopefully, he's able to get back on track. And I say that because he had no touchdowns in his 2 games prior to the bye week. But this offense is finally fully healthy, and he hasn't lost to the Bears in his career. But this is not some easy matchup by any means. No team out there in the NFL allows less fantasy points per game to the quarterback position than the Chicago Bears. They've only had 1 game all year where they allowed over 235 yards passing. This isn't going to be an easy one for Jordan Love. Coming off the bye, I've dropped him down a few spots here into tier 3. How about Jameis Winston going up against the New Orleans Saints? Another guy coming off the bye week, and now he's getting the chance to start against the team who he was with for the last 4 years in the New Orleans Saints. Now, we know he's going to want to try to light it up if possible. With guys like Cedric Tillman and David Njoku who have been absolute beasts here as of late, and a running game which really hasn't materialized here most of 2024, Jameis Winston's kind of one of those boomer bust type plays in week 11. Then we got Kirk Cousins going up against Denver, and dude straight fell off a cliff in week 10 against the Saints. 0 touchdowns after having 7 of them in his prior 2 games. Now he gets a matchup going up against Denver, and that could lead to Drake London being covered by Patrick Surtain. I gotta lower this ceiling this week on Kirk Cousins just due to the matchup alone, because the Denver Broncos allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, which only leaves us our last guy on the list, and it's Aaron Rodgers going up against the Indianapolis Colts. So the Jets are bad, then they finally turn the corner and look a little bit better, and then they suck again. Now, I know Arizona's playing great football right now. Let's give them a little bit of credit for what they did back in week 10, because Aaron Rodgers had only 151 yards passing and no touchdowns against them while having Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson. WTF. But now he gets a matchup going up against Indianapolis. They allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position, but you just never know what Jets team is going to show up. So there you have the top 20 quarterbacks for week 11 fantasy football. Now, maybe you see things a little bit differently. That's okay. Our rankings are not supposed to match. Just let me know what you think down below in the comment section, and maybe together as a community, we can make a few tweaks here and there and come up with the best damn rankings in all the land. But I'm going to go ahead and get out for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.
Analytics off the chain, other channels not the same. Jake and Kyle, you know the name. Headliner Nation, we running the game.